everyone. Andy Powers with Taylor Guitars here. I've got this instrument in my hands that we've been working on for a number of years. We're thrilled to be introducing it. This is a 324 Builder's Edition guitar. A couple of years ago, we conceived the Builder's Edition idea as a way to kind of a vehicle to introduce our V-Class bracing idea, that new internal architecture for the guitar. But this particular one is pretty special to us. One of the reasons, in addition to the super fun woodworking and instrument design, is this particular wood. Now, some of you might be familiar with our forestry efforts. And around the world, in different places, we've got all kinds of forestry projects that we've been putting effort at. You know, we're planting, propagating trees for future generations of instruments. And one thing that's in common with those is they're very forward-thinking and very long-term projects. I mean, in some of those cases, you're looking at not just 25 or 30 years, but maybe 50 years or 100 years or more. Now, that's great work to do, but one of the other things that we think about is, well, what can we do now? What can we do now to make the guitar world a little better? This instrument is introducing one of those projects. It's something we call urban forestry. This particular wood is a species that we call urban ash. It's also known as chamel ash. And it was propagated here in Southern California back after the close of World War II. Now, what's so interesting about this is that if you drive down say a freeway or a city street somewhere, you notice that there's trees planted on the side of the road. Well, those trees were put there for a reason. They're not naturally occurring, but they were put there maybe for their beauty or as a windbreak or a noise barrier. For whatever the reason, at a certain point, those trees will come to the end of their lifespan. Oftentimes, when they become a very large size, they turn into a liability and they have to be taken out before they drop limbs on somebody's car during a storm or blow over or do something like that. So all those trees, they're maintained, and at a certain point, they're taken out and replaced with younger trees. Most of the time, those trees are mulched in place. They're ground up and left there, and they become soil, which is great, but you're taking these trees and turning them into the least valuable wood product. Now, one of the things that Bob Taylor and I became interested in was the idea that, well, we might be able to make something out of those trees. There might be a future there. Maybe there's something that we can look into. In a way, it's the same concept that a guitar maker or a violin maker would have used hundreds of years ago. You're not going to go halfway around the world to find some little slice of wood to build a violin from. You're going to look around at whatever you have close at hand. I'll work with that. I don't have the luxury of going, thousands of miles away to get some special board. I'm going to look over there and say, that one will work. I'll use that. Let me figure out how to design around that wood's unique characteristics. So this is a project that we've embarked on with a group here in California called West Coast Arborists. And they're a fantastic organization. They manage a lot of those city trees. They maintain them, they plant them, they propagate them. And they're very forward-thinking in that they also were looking at what other avenues could we use these trees rather than just turning them into firewood or turning them into mulch. And so we became acquainted with them. And after several years of design and working on that, this is the first time that we'll get to introduce a wood like this. As a material, I've become a real fan of this particular wood. It has so many of the same characteristics that I love about mahogany. It's no coincidence that this wood originally came from the area where a lot of mahogany grew. It ends up with a very similar density, very similar weight, similar grain structure, and tonal characteristics. So this is something that we're really excited to get to be using for these models. It sounds a lot better as a guitar than it does as mulch. So this is something we're real thrilled about. So again, this is a new 324 Builder's Edition guitar with urban ash on the back and sides, and it's an awful lot of fun to play. Hey there, Andy Powers with Taylor Guitars here. And you're at my home workshop where I do a lot of our development work and get to make all kinds of fun things. I've got with me a new guitar that we've been building. This is a piece that we've added to our Builder's Edition collection. This particular model we call an 816. It's an 816 Builder's Edition, and we'll call it a cutaway because it does have a cutaway. But it's so much more than that. This one is something we call a soundport cutaway, where it's sort of half of a Florentine, but featuring a secondary soundport. Now, it's a bit of a head scratcher of a guitar because we're all familiar with guitars that have extra sound ports and guitars that have even partial cutaways. I've seen things like that before. But in conjunction with our V-Class internal architecture, this entire package becomes a really unique piece because we get to create a different type of sound. It's more of what I would describe as an orchestral sort of sound. Now, when I look at our guitars that we're manufacturing, I think of like the Grand Auditorium guitars or the Grand Pacific guitars. We have a few options that are all in this, call it the medium size in the world of small, medium, and large. There's a few different options. And in the same way that I know all of us musicians do not play the same way, we're not all looking for exactly the same voice out of our guitar. And so when I think of a Grand Auditorium instrument, man, that's like the quintessential modern Taylor acoustic guitar sound. And the Grand Pacific, that brought a different personality to the table. That was a whole different kind of flavor that I love very much. And when I was considering what we want to do with our Grand Symphony guitars, I thought, well, I'd like something that, again, is a totally different flavor than what we've done in the past. So this guitar, by using this idea of a secondary sound port plus a partial cutaway, we get to play with the air mass that's inside the body. It's technically known as the Helmholtz resonance, but it's the kind of sound that's made if you blow over the top of a soda bottle. That effect is very strong. It plays a big role in the voice of a guitar. And in this case, by combining these elements with the V-Class internal architecture, we get to make a different type of sound propagation. Think of it as the way sound travels outward from the guitar. It sort of immerses the player in this cloud of musicality or something. I don't know. I don't really know the best way to describe it other than it's a very immersive experience to listen to. As a guitar maker, when I look at an instrument, I don't simply want to make replicas of something. I don't want to make just copies of the same old thing or a million different shades of gray. I want each guitar that we build to have some purpose. It needs to have a musical reason to live. It's got to offer something to the player. And so when I was considering our Grand Symphony guitars, I thought, well, what can I do with this? Why should this guitar still exist? Why should it be something that we put effort into making? So I thought about its unique strengths. What does it have going for it? Now, a lot of times we talk about guitars in terms of measurements. It's easy to measure, say, across the lower bout of a guitar. I could stretch a tape measure over it and go, oh, it's, this so-and-so width and the waist is this wide and the upper bout or what have you. And that gives you some frame of reference. There's some information there. But what's even more significant is the curves that connect those dots. Because that largely is what determine the air capacity inside the body, what I think of as the lung capacity of a voice. It determines, the overall shape of how this top and back are going to work. And so the Grand Symphony body, the way that this set of curves works is there's actually quite a bit of lung capacity inside the body. There's a lot of airspace. So I thought, okay, well, I'll make something neat with that idea. How can we best utilize that? Well, if you're not careful, that kind of lung capacity tends to over-exaggerate a certain part of the guitar's register. And it'll emphasize a couple of notes at the expense of other parts. Well, to me, that's not as useful for playing music with. And so I wanted to experiment with a secondary sound port, but in so many of the guitars that I've built in the past, I don't always love the way that works. It can oftentimes cause as many problems as it fixes. If you have sound waves that are crossing up in undesirable ways, you can make notes that don't tune as well. You can lose projection out of the guitar. You can get some undesirable side effects. So I was thinking about that and figured, well, with the V-Class architecture, with that as a platform, because we have so much direct control over how the guitar functions, I might be able to incorporate a secondary sound hole. And then I thought about building, a partial style cutaway to retain a little more of the body's inherent size. I want to retain the air mass that's there. So instead of removing the whole thing, I can leave the back unbroken and keep a lot of airspace that way. And the real kind of magic came together when I started combining all of these ideas into this one guitar. It's a pretty tricky bit of woodworking to do. It's actually very difficult because, well, it's easy for me to say, you take a bite out of the guitar, put a new piece of wood there, and then drill a hole in it. That's far from how it actually gets built. It's actually it's been a testament to our tooling and engineering teams to figure out a way that we could actually execute this on a larger scale so that it's not just one guitar that I built by hand or two guitars. It's something that we can do consistently and repeatably. But when I combine all of these elements, the partial cutaway, the V-Class internal architecture, the secondary sound port that has an angular relationship to the primary sound hole, that's kind of when the magic happened for this guitar. To play. It's got this funny, real thick sound.